So we start a new unit now with what was called the Ancient West. What we mean by that specifically is the Mediterranean and the ancient world of Mediterranean and their religions. Prior to this slide, you'll see a number of maps that I included from ancient Babylonian, the Mesopotamian region, ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and ancient Persia. And the map immediately preceding this slide is of ancient Persia, which is modern-day Iran. And this is where we're going to start in my discussion here with the ancient religion of Zoroastrianism. Now, we have heard of Zoroastrianism before last semester when we began to talk about some competing Christian heresies. We mentioned Manichaeans and the Gnostics, and here we go full circle from our last class to discover this ancient Persian religion and how it really ratified and changed Western ideal of religion towards a system of ethical dualism, which I'll explain here in this slide in a second. So what exactly is Zoroastrianism? Well, it is one of the oldest monotheistic religious systems, if not the oldest, in the history of the world. It's likely predates certainly Abraham, but we see it coming into its own by 600 BCE, so it wouldn't predate Abraham. Abraham would be a little older than that. But Zoroastrianism dates back to 600 before the Common Era in Persia, which is modern Iran. And it stems from an ancient Iranian son of a priest, and the prophet's name was Zarathustra. And the reason we call this Zoroastrianism is that is the Greek name of Zarathustra is Zoroaster. So when the Greeks came into contact with this ancient Persian belief, they took a Greek term and labeled it Zoroastrianism. But if we say Zoroaster or Zarathustra, we're talking about the same individual, the same historical person who began this movement roughly in the 7th century BCE. So Zarathustra grew up in a pagan world where there were a host of spirits and demons and entities. The ideal of paganism in the natural world was what people worshipped. So the fact that Zarathustra began to preach about one wise, true Lord was quite revolutionary. He called this one Lord Ahura Mazda. But he also said that there was a contrary force in the universe, an evil force, which he named Angra Mainyu. And so what we do is we have a dualistic system here. We have a god of good, Ahura Mazda, and a god of evil, which is Angra Mainyu. And these two compete for the souls of humanity for eternity. And this is what we call ethical dualism, a system where good versus evil in the competition for humans and their eternal souls become a reality in this particular understanding or religious system. This is a two system of gods. You can see now how the Gnostics were using this when they began to apply this ancient philosophy to their own form of Christian heresy. So Zoroastrians, their famous text is called the Avesta, and its oldest section is called the Gathas. Now the Gathas is believed to have actually been authored by the prophet Zarathustra himself. And in the Gathas, the prophet talks about believers having to choose between moral life and a life of sin. But he uses different terminology. A moral life he calls following the truth, and a life of sin he calls following the lie. Now, today, most Zoroastrians are actually living in two places. They live in modern-day Iran, but most of them actually live in India. With the rise and onset of Islam, Zoroastrianism was persecuted and driven to specific places in Iran where it hid, and more specifically to India, where the largest number of Zoroastrians still live today. They have a belief in a resurrection and a final judgment, which will be a testing by fire, which your textbook will go into more detail about. Just a couple of rituals I want to mention about ancient Zoroastrianism. I have uploaded a YouTube video for you, and of course you have your textbook to read. But they have a very important rite of passage called Nevote for young men and women, I believe, between 9 and 12 years of age. It's kind of like a coming of passage rite that we see in Judaism, like we see with the bar and bat mitzvahs. Ironically enough, it's the ancient Persian Zoroastrian religion that set prayer 5 times daily. And this is something that the Islamic religion will later adopt in several centuries after Zoroastrianism is in the decline. We'll see this ideal of praying 5 times to remember the eternal presence multiple times a day actually comes from ancient Zoroastrianism. One of their important symbols is a symbol of fire. They believe that fire is a symbol of purification and immortality. And they have a very famous fire ritual, which I'll show you a picture of here on this next slide, called Yasna. And your book will also describe that. They have an important ceremony called Jajen, which is a ceremony of thanksgiving that's offered by two specific priests. Now, in the long term, what happened to Zoroastrianism is it was basically put into hiding, was exploited or pushed out of the areas of Iran and the Middle East where it was for centuries and had a huge impact on both Judaism, Christianity, and even Islam. It ended up in isolated pockets in Iran, modern-day Iran, but most specifically, the largest number of adherents are in India today. The most important contribution to Zoroastrianism has on the religious world of the ancient West is this system of ethical dualism, that there are two forces, of one of good and one of evil, and the universe is at war, if you will, between those two forces. Here we see the slide of the prophet Zarathustra. Notice he looks very Christ-like. Even the halo around his head, if we were to remove this halo and keep him in period dress, many people would probably mistake this figure as Jesus Christ. But this is actually the prophet Zarathustra. And the other picture to the right and lower, we see the fire ritual being performed here by a number of Zoroastrian priests. And the ideal is to cover their faces here and to keep the flame purified. Ironically now, many of us outside in the world today with our COVID-19 crisis probably look very similar to what these priests look like today. Moving on in our unit with ancient Mediterranean West, we settle on the Greeks. Most of you know the Greeks quite well. Most people in the Greco-Western Euro world and Euro-American world know the Greeks quite well. We know them because of their storytelling and because of their mythologies, and we know that they are the foundation of what will become Western civilization. Classical Greece certainly is. So when we talk about the ancient Greeks, the first thing we have to talk about is the setting and the area of which Greece, because of its geography, it has an important role to play in the way the Greeks live and the way that they develop their religion, their mythologies. Unlike Mesopotamia, Greece was a series of isolated islands and chains, which is very rugged. So Greece really lacked a lot of natural resource. And so the Greeks became people who were explorers, and they began to set boats out and colonize all parts of the Eastern Aegean and across the Mediterranean. So the Greeks, rather than working together in unison or creating long, stable civilizations like the Egyptians were able to do, for example, the Greeks preferred warfare and sea commerce, trade, and colonization. And this led to the Greeks' ideal of society being uniquely different. It also leads to a large number of different storytelling myths because every Greek city-state or polis had its own. So when we talk about Greeks, we can't really talk about the ancient Greeks as seeing themselves as a unified force of Greeks. They had no understanding of that. The Greeks believed that they came from specific city-states. So your city was your state. It was your government, and it was your loyalty. So you were Athenian, or you were Corinthian, or you were Spartan, but they didn't have a concept of a unified Greek language or identification. They were still very much in competition with each other amongst the Greek city-states. That competition, of course, led to one of the most famous historical wars of all time, known as the Trojan War, which did actually occur in the 13th century, around 1200 BCE. But that significant historical happening will be the basis of what will lead, ironically enough, to ancient Greek mythology and storytelling and belief in the Olympian gods, thanks to one particular person, Homer. But when we look at the origins of mythology, we really see that the Bible for the Greeks is the Iliad and the Odyssey. We're not sure exactly how old this story is. It certainly predates Homer, something Homer had inherited. And it dates back to the 13th century BCE, certainly. But the reason Homer is given credit is because Homer is the first to really put it down in some sense of storytelling that just goes beyond the oral tradition and begin to actually write and create mythological stories that introduce us for the first time to the likes of Zeus and Hera and Achilles and Ajax. So these heroes that we know from this great epic, it's really Homer that begins to weave in the specific color and description and understanding of who these very well-known Greek Olympian gods are to all of us today. So it's a two-part. Homer was so excited about the completion of the Iliad in the first story involving the Trojan War that he continued on to write a sequel, and that sequel is the Odyssey. And certainly both of these epics were something he inherited. I don't think he came up with the concept or notion of these on his own. I think he inherited them and began to embellish them into the modern kinds of story we know today. Certainly, I would rank the Iliad and the Odyssey as one of the most important historical documents in the history of Western civilization. They really do set the foundation. Our language, our scientific language, our understanding of the Greek gods and goddesses still affects our language, our government, and our understanding of religion even today. So what the Greeks put down here in classical Greece becomes really important to the history of entire Western civilization. The two-part story, the Iliad, describes a 10-year struggle between the unified Greek city-states under King Agamemnon, who's the Mycenaean king, versus the city-state of Troy under King Priam. And if you want to know the historical reason behind this war, it's for trade and commerce and for eliminating competition. But that's boring. The story of the mythology is so much more, richly indebted with the kinds of stories that we like to hear. Tradition claims that a beautiful woman, Helen, who was the queen of Sparta, was abducted and fell in love with a prince of Troy. And this love affair led to this war, which basically is going to change the course of human and Western religion and history from the centuries beyond. The second part of the story, the Odyssey, is the sequel of one particular Greek, King Odysseus, trying to get back to his kingdom of Ithaca after his sojourn of 10 years of being into the Trojan War. I don't want to ruin the story for you, but his journey home is made incredibly hard after he insults the god Poseidon. Every time he gets close to his home and his wife in Ithaca, he is blown further away from his home. So this two-part story, these epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, collectively have been known as the Greek Bible. Here's a quick map that shows you the historical happening of how the Greek city-states combined, and they had a huge naval armada that attacked the northern province of what is today Turkey, which is where the ancient city of Troy was discovered. Now, believe it or not, in the 1880s, the ancient city of Troy was discovered. The ancient Greeks called it Ilium, and a German archaeologist called Schliemann actually found and uncovered the ancient city of Troy. And on the fourth level through, down to Troy, at about the 13th century, archaeologists did find a ring of destruction by fire. So we should give the Greeks credit that when they do tell a mythological story, it's usually founded in some kind of fundamental truth or some kind of fundamental historical happening, which is then embellished to be more entertaining and to teach lessons of life, which is what myths do in their origin. But I just wanted you to see that there is some historical truth behind the Trojan War, and it does link up at about the right time, and the ancient ruins of Troy were discovered in the 19th century. So the Greeks aren't completely telling us a fabricated story. They are basing their stories on something that is true in its initial historical moment, and then embellishing it to teach us about the gods and our relationship with the universe. This famous movie starring Brad Pitt was a movie I did not particularly care for, but the one thing that the movie did get correct was the character Brad Pitt plays in the Greek hero Achilles. If you've ever read the actual Iliad, the character of Achilles is basically impenetrable. He has been born of a mortal father to a nymph mother, to a goddess mother. And when he was a child, she dipped him into the river Styx, which made him impenetrable to any kind of harm through arrow, sword, or spear. So he grew up as a great hero, the Greeks' greatest hero, really not being able to be killed or hurt during warfare. Only by his heel was he vulnerable, but no one really knew this until he was fighting before Troy in the famous Trojan War. The god Apollo, who wants the Greeks to lose, whispers into the bowmen's ears of Troy to shoot and aim at the famous hero's tendon on his heel, hence the term Achilles tendon, and poison an arrow to kill Achilles. And the hero does actually die this way. But the story portrays how one man's really pride and his abstinence to think that he was undefeatable is really about the time and the moment that he finds his one weakness that will lead to his destruction and his annihilation. The Greeks are very good at telling stories, and even those that are seen as invincible still have their flaws and their characters. And this is the birth of what we will call modern drama through both comedy and through tragedy. So the Greeks, through their stories, are going to actually develop the concept of modern theater. Here we see a list of the origins of the cosmos of the ancient Greeks. So most of you probably know from Greek mythology that there was complete chaos in the universe until Father Sky Uranus and Mother Earth Gaia began to bring form and creation to the universe. And the first race of beings that they created were not actually gods nor humans. They were a race of creatures called Titans. And the Titans were not as powerful as the gods necessarily, but they were certainly more powerful than any kind of human. And these Titans had rulers. The king of the Titans was Father Time or Kronos and Mother Rhea. And these two Titans begin to create the gods, the first gods. So this husband and wife begin to create children that, because of their power, are even more powerful than them, because the feminine and masculine powers of these two Titans is combining, creating children that will become even more powerful than their parents. The famous prophecy that Kronos was told was that his children would one day overthrow him and destroy him. So Kronos was very worried about this prediction, and so as his wife began to give birth to their children, he began to swallow them. And he began to swallow them one after the other during their birth, and Rhea, of course, the wife of Kronos, grew tired of seeing her children devoured by her husband. So on one particular birthing, she will hide one of her sons from her husband and throw a large boulder into his mouth instead, believing he has actually devoured his newborn son. That son is hid on an island in the Aegean and grows to god manhood. And of course, that son will be Zeus. Zeus grows to power and challenges his father Kronos and ends up defeating Kronos and killing him. He then splits open his father and begins to pull out his brothers and sisters, who become what we know as the ranking Olympian gods today. And here is a list of the Olympian gods that are probably most famous to all of us today. Hera is the wife of and sister of Zeus, who becomes queen of the gods. He had two powerful brothers. His first brother, Poseidon, was god of the sea, and his other powerful god, Hades, his brother Hades, was the god of the underworld. He had several sons and daughters, both through Hera and by other gods. Ares is the god of war. Demeter was actually Zeus's sister, the goddess of agriculture and fertility. Hermes, another son of Zeus. Athena, a daughter of Zeus that was born fully armored, as Zeus had a terrible headache one day. He pounded his head so hard that she emerged from the crack in his skull and is the goddess of wisdom. He had twins through another goddess, Leto. Zeus was quite promiscuous and had fathered many children through other mortal and god women, and not just Hera. And he had a famous set of twins called Apollo and Artemis. They were both brother and sister. And one of his most famous daughters, of course, the goddess of love and beauty, is Aphrodite. So just a list of the major Olympian gods. And the reason they're titled and categorized as Olympian is because they all lived on Mount Olympus in northern Greece. Lastly, for our Greek segment, gods and rituals. So the Greeks always portrayed, or normally portrayed, their gods in a big fancy word called anthropomorphic. And what that means is human form. And this is really why I think we like Greek mythology so much, and we have a closeness and fondness to it, is because the gods share our human quality. The gods can aid or hinder humans depending on their mood. Gods would frequently intervene with human affairs. As I told you, Zeus liked to father children through mortal women, and the fathering of those children through mortal women usually produced what we call the Greek heroes. For example, Hercules is a very famous example, or Perseus is a very famous example of Zeus's philanthropy of actually fathering illegitimate children through mortal women that then became very important Greek heroes in mythology. The gods enjoyed the pleasures of earthly existence, and it was said that the gods actually envied humans. Because gods were immortal and humans weren't, humans learned to take a zest of life and to squeeze as much out of life as they possibly could, knowing that ultimately their time was limited. The gods saw this as an advantage because they believed that the humans really lived their lives to the fullest because of their time restraint, whereas the gods were immortal. So the gods loved to intervene and be a part of the human experience, of the earthly experience. Home and temple worship was really important for the ancient Greeks, and we've covered a lot of this last semester when we talked about pagan worship as we talked about the rise of Christianity. The ancient Greeks also practiced ancient divination. We've talked about divination, the splitting open of an animal to read its intestines to predict the future. Greeks believed in oracles. These were famous geographical locations where they believed gods and goddesses resided. And through priestesses or priests or pythias, you could actually ask a god or goddess information about your future. And it was believed that a person who purified themselves and gave the right offering could actually speak to a particular god. Now, the most important oracle of ancient Greece was the Oracle of Delphi, which was the oracle of the sun god Apollo. Greek afterlife was ruled by Hades in the underworld, but the Greeks' ideal of the afterlife was a little bit different. They believed that all souls that died journeyed across the river Styx into Hades. Regardless of whether you were a good or bad person, Hades was simply the realm of the dead. It was where people dwelt when they passed on. Only gods got to live in the immortal realm of Mount Olympus in the heavens. The only half-mortal demigod that was allowed ever to live with the gods will be Hercules. Mystery cults and religions were other ways that the Greeks explored religion. We talked about that, joining a cult or a specific mystery religion, the most famous of which was the cult of Isis, which was imported by the Greeks from Egypt. Another way the Greeks explained the world around them was not only through gods and rituals, but also through the development of Greek philosophy, which would be for an entirely different class. Finally, we come to the ancient Romans here. Ancient Romans were descended from a number of different bloodlines. The Latin Sabines and Etruscans and even Greeks all combined to create what will eventually be called a Roman person. In the beginning, Rome, of course, was a small farming village along the Tiber River and was not much to look at. It was not the polished marble city of the emperors. It was actually more of a mosquito-infested swamp where small villages were trying to raise crops. Now, according to the legends, the Romans believed that two famous twins, Romulus and Remus, were the descendants of a Trojan hero called Aeneas, which is from another very important mythological Greek understanding. We'll talk about that maybe later. The god Mars apparently impregnates a Vestal virgin, and she gives birth to twins. And these two twins, of course, are Romulus and Remus. Romulus grows up and murders his twin brother Remus and becomes the first king and founder of Rome, according to legend. We do think there probably was an ancient monarchy in Rome long before they were a republic or an emperorship, and we believe that Romulus probably was an accurate historical person who was one time king or monarch of the area known as Rome, but the embellishment of the story makes it so much more interesting. The famous rape of the Sabines is mythology's way, the Romans' way, of saying that we are badass people not to be messed with because we were ultimately fathered by the god of Mars, which is the god of war. And so apparently this rape of the Sabines, Roman men had a reputation of not being the kind of men you wanted your daughters to marry. So in a ruse, the Roman king Romulus invites the Sabine families to come to sport in the arena. And upon assembling all of these people in the arena, he then has the soldiers block off the exits and murder all the Sabine men, and then impregnate the Sabine women for the next generation of people, of children that will now facilitate the population of Rome. Of course, this is completely fictitious. Nothing like this ever occurred in history, but it was Roman propaganda to tell the world that we are descended from the god of Mars and the god of warfare. It is what we do best, and we will take what we want when we want from anyone. So watch out for us. To be Roman means that we're going to rule the world. Eventually, the city of Rome was established. Etruscan kings became very powerful. A group of Etruscan people came in and began what we will call the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic was an experiment that lasted for several hundred years, but ultimately it will fail. Shortly after the Punic Wars, when Rome defeats the rival state of Carthage, Rome is now verged on an empire. We see the rise of a very important general, Julius Caesar, and through his assassination in 44, we see his nephew and adopted son, Octavian, establish the first Roman Empire and become the first emperor, renaming himself Caesar Augustus. And this leads to the rule of the emperors. This is just a brief historical overview of how Rome was established. Ancient Roman religion, many people think that the Romans didn't do anything but really copy what the Greeks had already developed, and it's simply not true. It's a misnomer that's not giving Roman credit where Roman credit is due. Long before the Romans ever came into contact with Greek mythology, the Romans believed in a supernatural life force in all of nature called noumena. And the early Roman gods were personifications of nature, and they were not portrayed anthropomorphically. This is something that the Romans learned to do later as they met Greek culture. Much like the kami that we talked about with Japanese Shinto, the ancient ideal of Roman noumena believed that spiritual presence of noumena inhabited objects, places, ancestors, and anything that was Roman. The Roman gods were believed to possess large amounts of this noumena, with the god Jupiter being their most powerful god. Jupiter will eventually come to represent the counterpart of Zeus in Greek mythology, but Jupiter was really something unique to the Romans themselves long before they ever met the Greeks. They did finally get influenced by the Greeks' religions and mythologies and began to take all the Greek gods and give them Latin or Roman names. Temple sacrifices and temple worship were just as important to the Romans as they were to the Greeks, and they also practiced mystery religions and cults, importing them from both Persia and Egypt. Then they come up with something called the emperor worship. We talked about this last semester in church history. This was a way that the emperor would use religion to unite the Roman Empire through religious nationalism, which was known as the cult of the emperor. And we know that this eventually brought Christians directly into conflict with Roman paganism by the first century, because the Christians were refusing to do their civic duty by following these pagan Roman beliefs of religious expectation. And this really wraps us around all the way to the last class we had last semester. We've come full circle.